introduction of the material that you're going to hear in a few minutes. To officially start this evening's program, I'll ask Fred Prejean, president of Move the Mindset, to take my place up here and set the stage for tonight's presentation. Thank you.
I like to be close to folks.
Okay.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Y'all sound like churchgoers, you know. My name is Fred Prejean. I'm fortunate to be the president of Move the Mindset. I would also like to introduce we're 5 board members. 2 of them are out of town. I'd like to introduce Professor Isvan Berkeley. Ish, would you raise your hand, stand? All right. And Mr. Frank Krakow, who's trying to sneak. All right. The other 2 board members are Mrs. Barbara Landor and Mr. Greg Davis. So, good evening and welcome to an educational event we hope you will appreciate and that will expand your knowledge of the local community and the people at the helm of its early development. I would also like to thank the media who did a very good job in getting the word out about this event. Thanks very much to you all. I see a couple of folks representing the media here. We're proud to help shed light on an abundance of history and knowledge as researched and uncovered by our courageous and diligent resident historian, Professor Rick Swanson. But first, I'm happy to introduce the sponsoring organization, which is Move the Mindset, which is one of Lafayette's most progressive organizations dedicated to strengthening community-race relations through education, free speech, nonviolence, and direct action programs. We are indeed an organization that has claimed a seat at the table to make our voices heard, and I'm sure you have heard it. Move the Mindset began its journey to establish racial parity in 2016 with 8 individuals. In that same year, we expanded to include 5 community organizations. In 2017, we expanded to 11 organizations. And in 2018, and today, there are now 15 collaborating organizations who support Move the Mindset in addition to individuals.
Okay.
These numbers attest to the fact that we are reaching people and our message is being supported. Promoting humanitarian dignity and respect is not a difficult message to understand. Our values are guided by integrity and unity, along with our 15 collaborating partners, all of whom share common values. We are a family of change agents who believe people are our most valuable asset. And because we believe this, we are actively involved in confronting issues which challenge the harmony and humanitarian lifestyle deserved to every citizen of this great country. To help you understand the humanitarian nature of our mission, I would like to explain one of our several programs. And let me tell you, before the summer arrives, you're going to hear more about our programs, likely through the news media. I'm going to keep it under hat for the time being. But please note that my comments represent our membership position and no one else. One major mandate of Move This Mindset is to educate the citizens of Lafayette about our history, including the Civil War, the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights era. Each of these occurrences throughout history have had a dramatic impact of important racial significance and contributions to framing the racial lifestyle we contend with today. This education lesson and project we espouse is necessary in order to understand and address why a Confederate Jim Crow statue in Lafayette downtown is a racially divisive structure symbolizing a dated period and values of a racist era of our past. It always gets me when I think about our past and see how similar in many ways it still is today. It is a lesson that must be taught and must end with an understanding why a white supremacist statue is objectionable and should be depicted in an appropriate context for what it really is. It indeed represents part of Lafayette's history, but it also represents a false narrative of Lafayette's history. It is not a symbol of pride. This Jim Crow monument celebrates a fictional history, ignoring the pain, ignoring the sacrifice, ignoring the shame, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement and the terror that it actually stands for. Today, we advocate enriching the educational experience of kids of all races and ensuring they understand our history accurately as we promote justice for all humanity, as well as empathy, compassion, and humanitarian assistance for less fortunate people. This endeavor has been a difficult journey, mainly because of false narratives. However, Move the Mindset accepts the challenge that institutional racism has kept getting. Much of that education and hidden knowledge will become obvious to you tonight as Professor Swanson recounts real facts and history of race relations here in Lafayette. Teaching this lesson, my friends, is what Move the Mindset is all about. While our immediate goal is to move the Alfred Newtown Jim Crow statue to a physical location of proper context, our intent is also to establish a community acknowledgement that slavery was evil, that seeking forgiveness is appropriate for the hatred slavery represented, and that reconciliation is the final frontier we must engage. This trifecta of events has never been addressed, but must ensue if we are to better race relations. Our values must reflect futuristic harmony that engenders peace and unity. After all, we are one people. We are one America. We are a collaboration of races, religions, and cultures. We represent the future that must ensure equality and justice for every citizen of this nation. There is a nexus between the history Professor Swanson so elegantly uncovers and the purpose of Move the Mindset. There is a nexus. As he recounts history so that we may learn of our past, Move the Mindset disseminates this learned history to correct the trajectory of our future and ensure our present values are consistent with contemporary humanitarian values. Our values should never remain stagnant, but instead should always trend toward making us a better person. As I conclude my address to you, let us be mindful, and please hear me well, that while establishing who is to blame for Lafayette's current social, economic, legal, and other racial disparities is important, that alone contributes little to resolving these disparities. The logical starting point instead should seemingly be to recognize and admit that there are racial disparities, to seek their causes, and to commit redress them. That's what Move the Mindset is all about. That's what Move the Mindset represents. We invite you to join Move the Mindset as we endeavor to create a welcoming community for all who believe in one America with liberty and justice for all. If you are a person of good conscience, we welcome you to join us. Our organization meets every first Monday of each month right here in this very room at 6 o'clock. We encourage you to be an agent of change as we are and adopt the values of a free and just society. That is the duty of every American. And that, my friends, is who we are and what Move the Mindset is all about. Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, our main attraction. Please view his educational and professional credentials on the handout you received, as they are quite impressive and voluminous. It is my honor to present to some and to introduce to others a man who has earned the respect of our community and is endeavoring to share the sometimes painful but nonetheless true, untold, and hidden history of our city, parish, and region. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you and ask that you help me welcome the Honorable Professor Rick Swanson.
I think I'm.
Are you mind?
All right, check. I think that's working.
You're
right?
good.
All right, great.
Yes.
Thank you, Fred, for those incredibly gracious words. And thank you for inviting me here, and to all of Move the Mindset for inviting me here. Thank you to the library for hosting this event. And thank you for all of you coming out tonight, especially given the weather. So I know you really do want to be here. And thank you. You know, this is sort of the culmination of over 2 years of research, and I spent several months putting this particular PowerPoint together. For those of you who have seen one of my presentations before, there's going to be a lot of overlapping information, but also a lot of new information, because what I've tried to do is create what I call an integrated history. I'll talk about that more in a moment. Each one of my slides is worthy of an hour-long presentation in itself, and I hope to, my next project after this presentation is really to start working on this as a book. And so, there's no way I can possibly cover it all tonight. We're going to barely skim through some of these slides. I'm just going to click on for a few seconds and click off. But if you want to see it in more detail, go to this website here, and I uploaded the whole PowerPoint as a PDF so you can scroll through it slowly at your own leisure and read all the details. So here we go. And I do want to give you a warning. Just like we couldn't talk about the history of Germany without talking about the Holocaust, we're going to be talking about a lot of harsh history, which there is a lot of very brutal history there in Lafayette Parish, so you've been warned. And I call this an integrated history because not only do we have a past that was segregated, but the telling of that history has itself been segregated. The reason we have Black History Museums or Black History Month is because Black history was largely left out of Southern history, especially in the South and including in Louisiana and largely locally. And so really we had these two different histories that really are a single history, because we are one people, we interact with each other. Just like you couldn't tell the history of a marriage by only talking about the husband or a wife, you'd have to talk about how they interacted. That would be the history of that marriage. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the history. So I'm trying to integrate this history. And I don't want to leave out the contributions of anyone other who than quote unquote white or black. But if you look at the census data here, it was pretty much zero, according to census data, all the way up into around 1970, 1980, when you even begin to have a fraction of a percent of what the census coded as other. So really, my presentation is going up to this history, looking at how essentially, it was a story of whites and blacks. It was a story of two people living together and interacting together, but that history was experienced very differently depending on if you were white and black. So let's begin with the founding period. I do want to say, this also would be worthy of a whole presentation, but if you notice, by the 1860 census, only 2 people of Native descent were even recorded and living in Lafayette Parish. So again, it's not to, if we were talking about some of the surrounding parishes and that history, we would have to include some of those stories. But in Lafayette Parish, that's just not the story. So again, not to leave out anyone of that descent, your contributions are important as well. But the story of Lafayette Parish up until at least 1970 is almost exclusively a story of white and black. So here we talk about the modern founding. Louisiana was created by the French, then it was turned over to Spanish, back to the French. You had early settlements in this area, and you might not be able to see, this area here was called the Tacapulco County, and that's early Lafayette Parish was formed out of what was the western part of the Tacapulco County, and then eventually Lafayette Parish was formed out of a section of that. So it split off from Vermilion Parish, and Petit Manchac was sort of the first settlement here in Lafayette Parish. It's right about where the Pinhook Bridge is today. The modern definition, this term of Acadian, is a completely modern concept. It's a modern definition. It was created by the state legislature and defined as 22 parishes in 1971. So do not confuse any of this history with this modern definition or term of Acadian. So where did the people primarily come from, the modern people that settled here? In order of the population, the first was West Africa. They came as enslaved people brought by the French, Spanish, other Europeans here to Louisiana. The second largest group was Acadians, who were expelled from Acadia by the English. They had been French and Catholic and refused, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, refused to give allegiance to England, which would have also meant basically denying their religion. They were expelled by England, and they were spread all throughout France and the Americas, but the largest single group came here to Louisiana. And then, of course, you did have, because we were primarily a French colony, you had the third largest group was people coming directly from France. And if you look at the 1860 Lafayette Parish ancestry, a majority of that was West African descent. There's a lot of facts here, but basically both the West African people and the Acadian people were victims of what's called a diaspora. They were forced to leave their homeland. West Africans were enslaved, the Acadians were expelled, and they both came here. According to the 1860 population, West Africans were about 52% actually of the population. The Acadians were about 30%, French were about 10 to 15%, and what they called Anglos, which is basically sort of the collection of other Europeans, was about 5 to 8%. And here you just see an example of a slave ship where you probably can't see from there, each one of these lines is a human being. Slaves, West Africans were packed like cargo into these slave ships. Now, what was the attraction of Lafayette Parish largely to white settlers? Why do I say white? Because after the Haitian Revolution, the successful Haitian Revolution, where the slaves overthrew their masters and became independent, Louisiana closed off, they outlawed any black immigration. And so immigration after that point into Louisiana was white only. Well, largely flat land, not a lot of trees, partially navigable waterways, partially navigable because at the time, the Bayou Vermilion was not navigable consistently past where the Pinhook Bridge is. The water would often be too low, it would be clogged with trees. So sometimes it would be navigable, but not consistently. There was, as I pointed out, very few remaining native population, unlike out in the west, where you'd have to worry about being attacked. It was pretty much open to settlement by whites. And if you wanted slavery, not only did American and French law allow it, but Spanish law promoted it. When Spain controlled this area, you could not receive a large land grant unless you brought slaves with you. And the more slaves you brought, the more land you were given. And you could not get the larger land grants unless you brought enslaved people. And here you see, looking for my laser. This is actually a very large, what do they call it? Megabyte file available from the Library of Congress. So I blew up just Lafayette Parish, and I added in the rivers to show you. You probably can't see, But all these little colorations of red and green, these were just the largest plantations in Louisiana, not the only ones. Just this map maker in 1848 decided they would just color the largest ones. But you see, they run, and then maybe you can't see from there, they run along the Mississippi, the Red River, the Bayou Teche, the Bayou Vermilion, and some others I just didn't put on the screen, the Ouachita River, the Bayou Lafourche. But you see here, because again, that was the most fertile land, this is where the plantations were largely put, and so that's where the primary settlement was in Louisiana. And if you look at Lafayette Parish and other parishes as well, both the tax and the census records from this period show that the majority of the wealth in these parishes was from ownership of human beings. More than land, more than agricultural crops, more than livestock. It was the majority of wealth. The large majority, if you were a large slave owner, that was the large majority of your wealth. Something like 80 to 90% in some cases was your ownership of human beings. So this was the economic foundation, the source of wealth in early Lafayette Parish. Now Lafayette Parish was founded formally in 1823. It was named after the French general, Lafayette, and it was governed by a police jury. Now the primary duty of the police jury was what it still is, roads, bridges, drainage, levees. In large part, those roads and bridges, and not so much levees in Lafayette Parish, although a lot of levees in other parishes, but roads and bridges and drainage, primarily those were created and maintained by enslaved labor. The other large thing that the police jury did was slave patrols, a system of men, white men on horseback with guns that would patrol around and make sure that no one was escaping, no enslaved people were escaping their plantation. And you would receive lashes if you were found off the plantation without written permission from your owner. And you could be lawfully murdered if you tried to resist that recapture. And there was, in fact, an attempt, a large-scale attempt by a couple dozen enslaved people to escape in 1840. The police jury referred to it as the conspiracy of 1840, but they were caught while they were still in the planning stages, and all of them were executed. The leader, Eugene, committed suicide in jail before he could be executed, probably because at the time it was practiced that you were tortured alive prior to execution to send a message to other enslaved people. You better not try to escape or rebel because you're going to suffer a violent, horrible death. The city of Vermilionville was then founded in 1824, basically a year after the parish was. And there was a debate about whether to have it right on the location of the Pinhook Bridge or by where the St. John's Church had been built. And because the St. John Church had become, and often churches are the center of the community, the hub of activity in the community, they had a public vote, and the public decided, let's have it by the church. And that's why the downtown of Lafayette is by St. John's Cathedral today and not by the Pinhook Bridge. Had that one out, then the downtown would be located right in the area of the Pinhook Bridge. You see there in the parish census, you have, it's not a majority yet, but a large portion of enslaved people, a slight majority of free people. Now what you had during this time period was a very divisive class system. Not just a three-tier racial system, but you also had classes of men and women, and single women versus unmarried women. This would be worthy of a whole hour-long talk itself to get into all the legal nuances of this. But basically, if you were free, you had to be 100%, I should put it this way. If you were free white, you had to be 100% pure European blood, and you had full legal rights then if you were a man. If you were a woman, you couldn't vote, couldn't serve on juries, were denied a lot of occupations. If you were a married woman, you were under the legal effect of what was called coverture. It's a very technical term, but it meant that the man's identity legally covered yours, so you had no independent authority to own anything, to contract, to sue, and basically the husband had the authority to discipline you or correct you. In fact, the law wouldn't even recognize the possibility that a married man could rape his wife. She had to consent on the theory that the husband had a right to sexual relations. So if you were a married woman, you were at the mercy of hoping that your husband was a very good husband. Otherwise, the law was not going to protect you. If you were a free person of color, or free black, you see here in 1860, 90%, is a small number, but 90% of them, according to the census, were mixed race. If you were, so you had much fewer rights than if you were white. You couldn't vote even if you were a man. You could have your homes investigated at any time to see if you were harboring escaped slaves. Anytime you traveled, you could be stopped by any white person to make sure that you were a free black and not an enslaved person. So you would have to show your written, either some papers or something to prove that you were free and not an enslaved person trying to escape. And if you were a married woman, you were also subject to coverage here. So you can see here, if you were even if you were free, but if you were a married black woman, you had far fewer rights than even married white women. And then, if you were enslaved, which here by 1860 was the largest segment of the population, according to the census, 78% are pure African descendants, pure African blood. And so you see that there was this very noticeable racial division in these tiers, that the more your blood got mixed with whites, the more you were allowed to be free and the more rights you were given. But what if you were enslaved? You had almost no rights. And again, this would be worthy of a whole hour in itself. Under the Louisiana Black Code, or the Code Noir, you had no right to marry, no right to own property, no right to money. Family members can be sold anytime after the age of 10. Torture and murder is allowed, pretty much almost with impunity if you disobeyed, tried to escape, resisted recapture. And this was really a complete cultural destruction. You lost your names, your language, your religion, your history. This is why, for example, Acadians can do their history all the way to Acadia and to France, and most Europeans can go all the way to and find old kings and queens of England they were related to. But if you're black, when you go back to slavery, there's just a wall of nothingness, because you weren't given a name or you weren't given a last name, the genealogy wasn't recorded, and so if you happen to be so lucky as to find a genealogy prior to 1865, you're one of the very few that can successfully trace your ancestry. And by the way, this is why that most enslaved people in this region then adopted, or really the Catholic religion was forced on them, the French language was forced on them, and their original culture was wiped out. And you have the testimony of enslaved people in Lafayette Parish. A lot of formerly enslaved people, I should say, their testimonies were recorded during the Great Depression by the federal government, what was called the Works Progress Administration. They sent writers, unemployed writers, around the South to try to locate people who had been enslaved during the time of slavery, and they asked them what their lives were like. And even people in Lafayette Parish said, we were whipped, we were beaten, even pregnant women were whipped. It was really bad, by and large. Women and young girls were raped by their owners, and then the children, some of them were set free, but a lot of them were kept enslaved or even sold to slavery by their owners. And we have corroborating testimony of Civil War soldiers that came through this region. Union soldiers said when they were liberating enslaved people, they saw the scars, the marks of slavery. And we don't have, at least that we know of, any surviving photo from an enslaved person here in Lafayette Parish. But here we have nearby St. Landry Parish. Historians aren't sure if his name was Gordon or Peter. And you might have seen this before. It's probably the single most famous photo of an enslaved person and showing the scars of slavery. And so this is sort of what it looked like. And in fact, one Union officer said, as they were doing medical exams of liberated men from Lafayette Parish, and they were undergoing the medical exams to join Union forces, and he said some of them were scarred from head to foot where they had been whipped. And one man's back was almost all one scar. So it's very consistent with the other photographic evidence that we have. So this is probably going to be the most controversial topic here tonight. And in fact, I was talking with one person before the meeting, and he said he's bracing himself for tonight. There's a popular myth that the Acadians weren't very involved with slavery. Well, that's not what the data bear out, at least not that I've been able to find. Within 10 years after arriving here in the Attakapaw census, within 20 years of arriving, the Acadians already 37%, and the text might be kind of small, 37% of Acadian households in the Attakapaw post in this region were enslaving people, at least one or more people. By 1860, and just ignoring all those specific statistics, basically a significant majority of Cajun households enslaved one or more people. And a significant majority of enslaved people in Lafayette Parish were enslaved by Cajun households. That's just the reality. Now, in fact, Carl Grasso, over there, who actually is one of the leading historians of this region, he actually calculated that at this time period, 83% of Cajun households enslaved people. So I haven't contacted him. I keep meaning to do so to find out why his numbers differ from mine. 'Cause it's extremely painstakingly tedious work. You have to go through the census records and try to figure out the ancestry of every single person, or at least every household leader in the census records, and then also match that up with what were called the slave schedules, which were taken at the same time but are recorded separately. And it's a whole lot of matching up to try to coordinate all this. So I calculated that about 59, almost 3/5 of Cajun households in Lafayette Parish enslaved people. Carl Grasso says it was 83%. But either way, whether it was 60% or 83%, the point is it was the large majority, and it was almost, well, if it's 60%, it was double the Louisiana and the Southern average of households that enslaved people. If it's 83%, it's about 2 to 3 times as much. And there you just see some of the names. But it wasn't just Acadians, it was all white people of all ethnic backgrounds. And this is just a list of people enslaving more than 10 people. You see Acadians, French, English, German, Dutch, Irish. But the point here is that the Cajuns, within a very few short generations, bought into the American way, the Southern American way of that you make your way in life, economically you succeed by enslaving others, and that's the main source of your wealth and economic advancement. So here again we see in 1860, half the population was enslaved, half was free, a small percent of free black. This is an average of about 10 enslaved people per household, but an average can be skewed a little by the larger slave owners, so I calculated the median, which is about 4.5, meaning half the slave-owning households in Lafayette Parish enslaved 5 or more people, half enslaved 4 or fewer. But here's a really important point. Even though, quote-unquote, only half the households or so enslaved people, almost everyone, even if you didn't own a slave, benefited from or even aided in slavery. Not only did people own slaves, but they rented slaves at the time. Just like people rent cars today, or you rent apartments if you can't afford a house, people would rent slaves. All the businesses and their employees depended on the money. I mean, just look at all of the businesses and employees whose incomes in Lafayette depend on the booming economy of this area. You would be out that money even if you're not involved in the oil industry, for example, or even if you don't work at UL. Just think of all the money you would lose your business if those industries closed up. The roads and bridges were maintained largely by enslaved labor. So if you use them at all, you're benefiting from it. The parish taxes, because they were based on wealth, then that's primarily where the parish taxes came from the large wealthy slave owners. And that supported the roads, courts, a small school system at the time, so anyone who used those benefited from it. Even if you didn't own slaves, just like today, you might go, I don't own a house, but my rich uncle is about to die and I'm going to inherit his house. So it's all the people who are waiting to inherit. All adult white men, according to law, had to serve on the slave patrols that I mentioned already. So even if you didn't own slaves, it didn't matter. You had to serve on the slave patrol and help hunt down to maintain escaped slaves, to maintain the system of slavery. And you had a psychological belief in your racial superiority. So the point is, it would be remarkable. You'd have to live in some isolated part of the parish, never use the roads, never transact business, be sort of like the 1860s survivalist equivalent in order to really not benefit or support slavery. So everyone benefited, almost everyone, 99 to 100% benefited or supported slavery. And by comparison, historians call this the Black Belt. You see this darker region. This was produced in 1860, this map by the Census Bureau. This is the percent of the population enslaved. And you see there's large areas of the South, the Appalachians, northern Arkansas, East Texas, South Florida, where the population of enslaved people was not nearly as concentrated as other parts of the South. So where it's concentrated, this is called the Black Belt. And Lafayette Parish was right at the edge of the Black Belt. And by comparison, you see here the percent of the population enslaved, pretty much half in Lafayette Parish. For the modern parishes of Acadiana, it was 58%, but for the Confederacy as a whole, it was only 39%, only in quotation marks. And for percent of free households that were enslaving one or more people, Lafayette Parish, it was half. That's highest in the biggest state, higher than Louisiana's average of 29%, and the Confederacy's average of 30%. So whether you look at the percent of the population that was enslaved or the percent of households that were enslaving, it was much higher in Lafayette Parish on average than the rest of the South. So it's no surprise then that secession occurred. because Lincoln had been elected in the Republican Party on a promise to stop the expansion of slavery. And if that occurred, it meant that you wouldn't have new states being entered into the Senate. There would be slave states. The free states would soon be able to outvote the slave states in the Senate. They were already outvoting the slave states in the House of Representatives because the free white population of the North was largely outnumbering the free white population of the South. So the South looked at this as sort of their last line of defense. They had to have slavery expand, or slavery was going to eventually die because they would be boxed in and quickly outvoted in the Senate. And you see quote after quote after quote by But it wasn't just an economic struggle. Because remember, I just pointed out that even non-slave owners have benefited from slavery. They've been taught a psychological sense of superiority. And it was also in part a religious crusade, because by this time, in order to justify this, ministers of all denominations taught that blacks were an inferior race, and this was God's ordained racial order, that whites were superior to blacks and were supposed to rule over them. And so ministers taught that the North was, here you see the term, atheistic. If you teach the equality of races, you must be an atheist. You're going against God. And so this is another reason why even non-slave owners were willing to fight, because they said, my goodness, we're fighting a holy crusade here to maintain God's racial order in the South. So Louisiana and Lafayette Parish were actually at the forefront of secession. Even more so Lafayette Parish. You see here the vote for the pro-slavery presidential candidate, Breckinridge, was 80% in Lafayette Parish, only 45% in Louisiana as a whole. Lincoln wasn't even allowed on the ballot in Lafayette Parish or Louisiana, so he didn't get a single vote of one person. And here, when it came to the parish secession vote, you had 87% in Lafayette Parish voting for their Senate district delegate to the secession convention, and 100% of the vote going to the parish delegate to the secession convention because he ran unopposed. And that compared to Louisiana's total of only 52% voting for the pro-secession delegate to the secession convention, as opposed to the delegates who said, well, maybe we ought to not to secede, or at least not right away. But here you see all the states, when they seceded, sent what were called commissioners to the other states, sort of like an ambassadors, because they were, they hadn't formed the Confederacy yet, so they were sort of acting as independent nations. And here you see the formally appointed by the Louisiana governor, the commissioner to Texas, saying, Louisiana looks to the formation of a Southern Confederacy to preserve the blessings of African slavery. This is what they were communicating with each other. And the Lafayette Parish delegate was former Louisiana governor at the time, Alexander Mouton. He actually then, when he went to the secession convention, he became the president of the secession convention. And here you just see a couple, now we don't have any surviving copies of the Lafayette, what was called the Lafayette Advertiser from that time period. But we do have the nearby Opelousas Courier. And here you see the Opelousas Courier saying, the slavery question is the only one which has ever threatened the permanency of the American Union. Not taxes or tariffs or trade, or differences of culture between North and South. So the point is that you had Southern whites saying, we're going to fight to keep people enslaved, and enslaved people not really having a say either way because they were enslaved. So now you had the Civil War. The Civil War had a massive impact on Lafayette Parish. In the spring of 1863, Union General Banks brought about 30,000 Union soldiers through this area, what was called the Bayou Teche campaign, and they made it all the way up to Alexandria and then retreated. Both Union and Confederate records at the time report that Banks liberated about 10,000 enslaved people. 10,000 during that time period. Now, some traveled back by rivers or were escorted in small groups, but from Alexandria, he escorted a group of 6,000 enslaved people, and actually turned it over to one of his other generals. And they marched from Alexandria back all the way to what was called Brashear. That's Morgan City today. It was called Brashear then. And so April 17th, 1863 was the Battle of Pinhook Bridge, where the Union forces came through, defeated Generals Taylor and Mouton, and basically liberated, or at least guaranteed the liberation of at least a part or a large part of Lafayette Parish, and were able to continue on the way to Alexandria. But knowing that their enslaved people were going to be liberated, both Union and Confederate reports show, and newspaper reports at the time show, that a lot of slave owners forcibly took their enslaved people into far western Louisiana, far northern Louisiana, or even into Texas to make sure that Union forces did not liberate them. Now, it was very destructive here of Lafayette Parish and the other parishes. Both Union, remember, we didn't have railroads at the time yet through this parish. You're trying to travel and supply these large armies over hundreds of miles. It was too difficult to do that, so both the Union and Confederate armies basically survived by foraging in the area, in large part. And so they confiscated, and both armies either took what would benefit them militarily, and they were both under orders that if they couldn't take something with them and it was going to benefit the other side, if it got captured by them, they were under orders to destroy it. And so you probably heard one of the common narratives of this area is, oh, the Union forces came through here and plundered and destroyed. Well, the Confederate forces did just as much because they were under the same orders. And you also probably heard sometimes, well, Union forces came through and stole a lot. Well, a lot of that was actually, whether it was silverware, jewelry, money, a lot of that was taken by enslaved people as they were liberated as some almost token trivial compensation for a lifelong enslavement. So they took what they could carry with them, even to have the tiniest shred of something to start a new life with. And one of the biggest things, one of the biggest surprises I found in reading this was that even a lot of the confiscation that General Banks and his forces did was then used to fund humanitarian relief efforts for now these 10,000 liberated, they were basically war refugees. They had no education, no money. They needed food, clothing, housing, medical care. And you see here, General Banks writing, and he says, the administration of these charities has been a labor of far greater intensity and suffering than the creation of an army and the conduct of campaigns. So that's powerful. What he's saying is that he's spending more time and resources on humanitarian relief efforts than he actually is fighting the war. That's remarkable. So there were a lot of Civil War soldiers from Lafayette Parish. You don't hear about all the Union soldiers from Louisiana, but there were about 24,000 what were called U.S. colored troops, and many loyal white Louisianans also fought for the Union. In Lafayette Parish, you had a few hundred white Confederates, such as Brigadier General Alfred Mouton, a picture on the right just before the Civil War, and a couple hundred formerly enslaved black men that joined the Union forces when they were liberated, including Lafayette Parish, and we know that from Union war records, memoirs, and even the Vermilionville Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War. You see recordings of discharge, Army discharge bonuses to freedmen that had returned here to Lafayette Parish. Interestingly, probably the most sort of ironic thing I found, one of the most ironic things in my research, is that there was actually a black Union soldier named Alfred Mouton, the exact same name as the Confederate general. And so I put this picture on and then realized, oh, if I don't say pictured on right, people might not know which Alfred Mouton this is. And lest you think, oh, Dr. Swanson's making this up, Alfred Mouton, same as Alfred Mouton. No, my wife and I went to Washington, D.C., and there you see in the National African American Civil War Memorial, where they list on these stainless steel engravings here every single name of every member of the U.S. colored troops, we found Alfred Mouton. Luckily, you could go and look up a listing if you could go look. I wouldn't want to have to read through 100 copies. But also one of the most controversial topics for probably a lot of people is I've been able to discover pretty solid evidence, by his own admission, of war crimes by Confederate General Alfred Mouton. And now a lot of people will say, well, they weren't really war crimes back then. Yes, they were. Even under what were called the customs and usages of war at the time, these were considered war crimes. First was enslaving and endangering civilian non-combatants. Here you see Confederate General Alfred Mouton saying, by the most strenuous efforts, Negroes were collected, this is his terms, and he used them basically to build earth and defensive works, with only intermittent interruptions occasioned by the artillery fire of enemies. So he took enslaved civilians and was forcing them to work under enemy fire, jeopardizing their own lives. He also enslaved free civilians. When, here you see the date of July 17, 1863. Remember I said that General Banks and his forces had taken all those liberated people down to Brashear, what is now Morgan City. Well, within a short time, Union forces were withdrawing most of their forces to go fight the Battle of Port Hudson, and that left Brashear largely unguarded. Just a small Union force was there. Confederates, led by General Taylor, but accompanied by General Alfred Mouton, were able to defeat that force, and when they did, they re-enslaved 2,000, an entire war refugee camp of 2,000 freed men, women, and children at that camp. They traveled a few miles over to what was called Bayou Boeuf, and they enslaved another, it's unclear, between 2,000 and 3,000 people there, along with a bunch of people, free people that were now at work in the plantations down in what they called the Lafourche district. And so we know at least he was a direct participant in enslaving those 2,000. So these were free civilians now, and he re-enslaved them, and the reports show, both in Confederate reports and Union reports, that he then took Confederate forces then took them back across Berwick Bay and sold them all into slavery in the western parishes of Louisiana. But here's the worst thing I discovered. When those Union forces were captured, both in Brashear and in Bayou Boeuf, there was a small contingent of what were at the time called either Native Guards or Corps d'Afrique. They had not been called U.S. colored troops yet, but they were black Union soldiers with white commanders. And some of them were captured. It's unclear the number, though. I'm still trying to figure out the exact number, but at least a small number of them were captured in both Brashear and Bayou Boeuf. The white commanders were sentenced to execution. It's not clear whether they actually were executed, but they were at least sentenced to execution. And what's really unclear is those black soldiers disappeared. We don't know what happened to them. There were some accounts of murders among some of the people that were left in Brashear, but unconfirmed accounts. You know, we call this the fog of war because there's so many rumors and it's often hard to know. So they're unconfirmed accounts. But at the very least, these men who were Union soldiers were enslaved and sent off with the other captured black men and women into slavery in western Louisiana. Now, to do that to a POW, even at the time, was a violation of the usage and customs of war. This was definitely a war crime. And Confederate forces under Generals Taylor and Mouton did that in Brashear. All right, so Lafayette Parish politics. Now we move past the Civil War. And by the way, I just want to point out, because those war refugees in Brashear, a lot of them had come from Lafayette Parish. So what you had was a Lafayette Parish citizen committing war crimes against a lot of other Lafayette Parish citizens. So now you have a long period of Lafayette Parish politics. It started out on a hopeful note. After the Civil War, you had what were called the radical Republicans, and they were called that by their opponents because they said, well, these radical Republicans want racial equality. That's a radical idea, and still historians use that term, but that's all it meant, that they wanted racial equality, voting, education, and so on. And so the Republicans in Congress were able to pass civil rights legislation. They were able to get the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments passed to the Constitution. Whereas what was then the Democratic Party, the Southern whites, still wanted to maintain white supremacy. But because there were still U.S. troops in the South enforcing these new civil rights laws, there was a widespread black voting in the South, and black elected officials were elected all across the South, including Lafayette Parish. The first black elected official in Lafayette Parish was Fortuné Riard, Alexander Fortuné Riard, but he went by Fortuné. And he became the parish delegate to now write a new he was elected in 1867 to write a new Louisiana Constitution that would put racial equality in the Constitution. And it did. So he helped write and was a co-signer of the new Louisiana Constitution that provided for equality in education, in voting, and even in business accommodations. They basically put the 1964 Civil Rights Act into, or the forerunner of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, into the 1868 Louisiana Constitution. And no one has yet been able to find a photo of him anywhere, but I and some other people are still looking. But because Southern whites, including Lafayette Parish, could not stand the thought of racial supremacy, and again, this doesn't make sense unless you understand the Civil War and slavery, because they had all believed in this notion that the races were not equal. And so even though they had been defeated, they could not accept the concept of racial equality. And so you had white terrorist groups rise up, because given that there was such a large black population, the whites couldn't outvote them, so the only way you could defeat them at the ballot box was to terrorize them and to basically not voting, assassinate their officials, and that's what happened. And just two of the biggest groups during this time period, known as Reconstruction, because the U.S. government was trying to rebuild or reconstruct the South based on one, racial equality. You see here Confederate Colonel Alcibiades de Blanc said the white race must and shall rule, and he basically created what were called the Knights of the White Camellia. Later you had the local Lafayette Parish judge and former Lieutenant Governor Charles Homer Mouton being the local leader of the White League, and he said we cannot consent to Negro social equality or the transfer of government to the hands of the African race. And so they led this systematic terrorism. And you see here the results in Lafayette Parish. This is the 1868 presidential election. Former Union General Grant was running. He was the pro-civil rights candidate. 0 votes. Not even, you remember, it was a majority black population in Lafayette Parish in 1860 census. Not one person voted for Grant because they had been systematically terrorized. And in fact, the Vermilionville Freedmen's Bureau shows that there were assassinations of black leaders in Lafayette Parish. And by the time then Reconstruction ended, basically, if you look at how the U.S. government, the American people are tired of U.S. forces occupying Iraq and trying to stabilize that country. We're tired of occupying Afghanistan, trying to stabilize that democracy. Well, the same thing happened here. Northern whites said, we're tired of trying to stabilize racial equality and democracy in the South. We're done. U.S. troops pulled out. They ended enforcement of the civil rights laws that they had passed. And so then white supremacy returned. And just as an example of that, the leader of the white terrorist group, the White Camellia, Alcibiades de Blanc, was then appointed as a Louisiana Supreme Court justice. So that just shows you how much white supremacy returned in just a few short years. But it wasn't just Lafayette Parish, it was a systematic pattern of terrorism across all of basically southwest Louisiana. Here you see the percent of the population was black, and I chose the 1870 census because the 1868 election was much closer to that than the 1860 census. And there you see 1.1%, 0, 0, 0, less than 1. Only in St. Mary Parish was there significant black voter turnout. So this systematic terrorism, again, Lafayette was just a pattern of this terrorism. So then after Reconstruction ended, you had basically, instead of one party rule, you did one party rule, you had one race rule in Louisiana. Now that whites had retaken power, they got rid of the Louisiana Constitution that provided racial equality, they rewrote new constitutions that ended civil rights and made it really difficult for blacks to register to vote. And here you see across the South, or this was actually Louisiana, from 1910 to 1944, black voter registration was less than 1%. And from 1900 to 1960, across the states of the former Confederacy, there was not one single black elected official. It was 100% white Democrats, all the way up until 1960. And that included in Lafayette Parish. So mayor, city council, school boards, state and local representatives, congressional representatives, all leaders were 100% white during this time period. And in order to enforce this, if you dare question the status quo or do anything else that questioned or challenged the racial order, you would be lynched. And there's a common misperception that lynching is being, you hanged a person by a noose. Typically what happened at this time period, you can go to the Library of Congress Chronicling America and look through old databases of newspapers read at the time. Typically what happened was the person was tortured alive. They had fingers and toes cut off, ears cut off, nose cut off. They were shot, stabbed, burned alive, and then you would hang their dead body up as a symbol to other black people. You better not challenge the racial status quo, because this is what will happen to you. So the body was hung up as a symbol after they had been brutally murdered. And so you had thousands of these across the South, including 6 at least documented cases in Lafayette Parish. And during this entire time period, there was only one conviction across the entire South. One out of all these thousands of lynchings. And it wasn't until 1965 that the Federal Voting Rights Act finally legally required equality for voting. And just, you probably can't read any of these. If you look at the slides on that link I gave you earlier, you can go and look at just some of these clippings of some of these murders and such in Lafayette Parish. So what did whites do now? They had the political supremacy. Now what did whites in Lafayette Parish do? Well, the first thing to do is to physically isolate blacks apart from whites in every way they could think of. Now my wife said, don't put that on the slide, people can't read it. I said, yeah, but the point is to show just how overwhelming it was. Again, go on the slide, it's every possible way, schools and just everything you can think of. So you have here schools, prisons, streetcars, railroads, marriage, interracial marriage was forbidden, apartment buildings, even pool rooms and billiards halls, Lafayette in 1915 outlawed interracial friendship. Basically, they said if you're a white person and you're seen going around any place where black people live or meet or congregate, you are a criminal vagrant. And so they tried to make sure that the whites would not intermingle with blacks or vice versa. And just to show you how silly it was taken, now most of this, if it's just in black bold, it was imposed by the state, so it was a statewide law, but Lafayette Parish took it beyond this. And so you see some of these, for example, the vagrancy ordinance I just mentioned, refugee camps, which I'll talk about in a moment, residential neighborhoods, which I'll also talk about in a moment, but just to show you how silly and extreme this was taken, here's a little clipping from the Daily Advertiser in 1956. Because there were segregated Mardi Gras parades, and state law outlawed any mixing of the races at any public events, like festivals or dances or whatnot, the city of Lafayette, so we need to make sure this doesn't happen. But you know, at Mardi Gras, people wear costumes, they wear hoods, you can't tell the person's race. So the city of Lafayette said, we'll outlaw that you can't wear gloves. That they took this. Now, one of the biggest events that happened in the early 1900s to Lafayette Parish was the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. Just to give you an example of how big this was, and by the way, this is what led to the modern system of levees we have and flood controls for the Mississippi River. Lafayette had a population of about 15,000 at the time. 20,000 refugees from the Atchafalaya Basin, along with several thousand workers, came here. So this would be, you know, the equivalent. Remember, a few years ago we had the evacuees from Katrina and Rita, but now imagine if it was, we had a population of about 125,000 at the time. Imagine 150 to 200,000 people came here to Lafayette Parish to seek refuge. That's sort of to give you a sense of the scale of what the city was dealing with. So it was a massive relief effort, not just by the city, but the Red Cross, the US government. But even in this desperate need of people, the city said we can't have whites and blacks being taken care of together. And so the city segregated the refugee camps. Now here's something that still impacts us today. In 1923, the city of Lafayette passed what's called a racial zoning ordinance. Now, it didn't name any neighborhoods. What it did was by street, it said, you know, go up this street, and we're going to say that these are Negro communities, and everywhere else will be a white community. And if you're a business owner or a resident, you can only, and you're white, you can only live in the white community. If you're a black business owner or black resident, you can only live in these two designated communities. But they did have the foresight. They said, well, we realize that the population will grow over time. So the outer boundaries of these two neighborhoods, they said, will be the corporate boundaries, so they can expand outward rather than expanding inward into the white areas. And I ran the data for 2010, and look at how remarkable that the residential patterns in 2010 still, you can still see the remnants of that 1920. And I couldn't figure out why. At first I thought it was because the Supreme Court had already actually ruled that this kind of ordinance was unconstitutional. I thought, oh, they probably either didn't know it and then figured it out, or they knew it and just wanted to get it on the books so everybody knew where you were supposed to live. Well, no, I finally tracked down on microfilm an old Daily Advertiser over at McNeese University, where it turned out, and I'm not sure which section it was, but there were a handful of white people that got trapped on the inside of these boundaries of the Negro communities, and they were complaining that their property values were going to go down. And so they complained, you can't do this to us, this is going to hurt our property values. And so the city council repealed the ordinance. And probably by that time they realized it was unconstitutional, so they never reissued it. But the point was, it sent a message, and now it was on paper. Hey, everyone, everyone knows where you're supposed to live, and the bankers and landlords and everybody now knows, they see these boundaries where you're supposed to be living. So even though this wasn't enforced by law, it was enforced through private means. And by the way, just to see sort of the lingering effect of this, I found a 1946 Pope's classified business directory, actually in the library here, and it listed whether you were a white or colored business, and I plotted them on the map, and you see it had started to expand outward. It started to not be strictly segregated at the time as much, but it was still mostly concentrated in those areas. But here's the point then, that even though legal segregation, residential segregation, wasn't allowed by the Supreme Court, private segregation did. And so White owners and landlords wouldn't sell or rent to blacks. White-owned businesses wouldn't serve you. Banks wouldn't give you loans to live in the improper neighborhood, and that was called redlining, was that practice. Unions also wouldn't allow membership to black workers. Even private white schools wouldn't allow black students. Even churches that the national denominations didn't segregate, but the local members of the denomination did, and that's why we have so many black churches and white churches, still historically in this area. And even if you yourself, you might think, well, okay, but if you sell your home, at least let the next person do what they want. No, because it was put in, these are called restrictive covenants. And a lot of deeds still have these for various reasons, like mineral rights and whatnot. But here, a lot of white people put it in, or subdivision developers put it in their deeds that if you buy this home, you can never sell it to anyone other than a white person. And I did just a couple hours of search in the courthouse and found 3 subdivision plats that listed these restrictions on them. So for every house in these subdivisions, Wu-Tang Gardens, Jules Simon, Simone, and Oak Lawn Extension. So if I just found these 3 in a couple hours, I can only imagine how many different homes or subdivisions had these in them. But what was interesting, because there were still so many black domestic workers at the time, the whites made sure, well, we don't want this to restrict that, so we'll say that this doesn't apply if you have a domestic servant of a different race living with you. So you can't sell your home to a black person, but you can have one living with you. They're your domestic worker. And this wasn't just Lafayette. Again, there's a system in the area, and I still have a couple cities to finish the research on. It's very time consuming to go around all these city vaults and look through big old books 1 page at a time, and a lot of them are handwritten, you can barely read it, so it's very time consuming. But you can see this was a systematic pattern. Interestingly, and some of you, this may be new to you who heard my talk before, I found that both Vieux-Plot and Brobridge enacted residential segregation ordinances as well, even before Lafayette Parish did. But there you see again, this point is that this is just a systematic pattern of segregation in this region. So what about education? You've heard the concept of separate but equal, which the U.S. Supreme Court upheld in 1896. It was never separate but equal. In fact, it was so unequal, it was almost a joke. And so you had 2 different school systems in Lafayette Parish, one for whites, one for blacks. And just some of the disparities show here. This is a LPSS, Lafayette Parish School System data in 1911. You had 28 white elementary schools, including a high school, with over 2,700 white students. You had 1 black elementary school with only 225 black students. And the first high school for blacks wasn't created until 1914 by Holy Rosary Institute, and the first public black high school wasn't created until 1927. And what I found also interesting was that the Lafayette High School, its official name was the Lafayette High White School, but they couldn't decide because in the incorporation they also said the Lafayette White High School. So whether it was the Lafayette White High School or the Lafayette High White School, that was its official name when they created it. And here you see Paul Breaux, the first black principal, with some students there. And as this continued on into the late 1900s, you see here an extremely different educational system for whites and blacks. In 1954, most towns allowed a 12th grade education for whites but not for blacks. Advanced subjects were taught in the white schools that would prepare you for college, not in the black schools. Bus transportation was provided to the white schools, not to black schools. White teachers were paid twice as much as black teachers. And the results of this are shown in census data from 1960. I don't know why they chose adults 25 years or older, but that's what the census did in 1960. That of adults in Lafayette Parish, 25 years or older, the median years of education for whites was 11 years. And if you count kindergarten, that'd be a 10th grade education. The median education for blacks was about a 2nd grade education. And this was 3rd lowest rate in the state, only other than St. Martin Parish and Evangeline Parish, which is interesting because they're in this region. So then you have to ask, well, what was it about this region that would cause greater suppression? And so, also then if you look at years of high school, or adults, again, this is Lafayette Parish, 1960, adults 25 years or older with basically a high school diploma. 46%, almost half the white population, only 6% of the black population. We're going to come back to that moment, that it's a huge black population differential. So desegregation was very long and slow. The U.S. Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education said that this is illegal, school segregation is illegal. But if you notice, it took until 1971. So this is 17 years for the Lafayette Parish school system, finally after repeated lawsuits to finally end. And the first year where any grade at any school was integrated was 1971. And one of the organizations that opposed school integration was called the Citizens Council. They began as the White Citizens Council, then they changed the name to the Citizens Council. But you see their motto there, states' rights and racial integrity. The state's right they wanted was the right of the state to segregate schools. And racial integrity, they wanted racial purity. So why were they so insistent on keeping schools segregated? Well, what they said in all their literature is that if you allow, in high school, right, you allow boys and girls to get together, guess what's going to happen? They're going to fall in love, they're going to make babies, and they're going to make mixed race babies, and that's going to destroy the purity of the white race. And that was their lead argument as to why the races should not mix in schools in its organizational enabling legislation. It went through some name changes, but again, let's look at the 1960 data here. Lafayette Parish adults, 25 or older, 1960, with some college. So this is 1 or more years of college. Could be 1 year, could be a complete degree. 25% of the local parish population had a college degree by 1960. Only 3%. And that was not because you went to UL, college education, or you just couldn't afford it. You couldn't afford to travel and go elsewhere. Which is in fact why the federal court finally ruled that UL had to integrate. They said because white students can afford to go right here, they can stay at home, it's a lot cheaper. If you're a black student, you have to travel all the way to go somewhere else, and so that's not equal. That you have to give them an equal financial opportunity to go to college. And so that was the grounds for the federal district's ruling, federal district court. And so it was formally or officially integrated in 1954, but just due to a lot of resistance by faculty and students, it didn't really fully integrate until the mid-1960s, when it integrated not just the classrooms, but all of the other amenities at the university. So now, what about economics? The railroad had a huge impact. That's really why, if you look prior to the railroad, Lafayette was smaller than Opelousas, it was smaller than Franklin, it was smaller than St. Martinville. We were not that big a community. Opelousas was sort of the cultural mecca of this region. It had actually been the Confederate state capital for a time during the Civil War. So what happened? The railroad. You see here, the railroad junction, they decided to put right here in Lafayette Parish. This is an 1883 railroad map, and this junction right here is right here in town. And so it made, this wasn't in Franklin, it wasn't in Opelousas, it wasn't in St. Martinville, and so that began to attract the economic development, first by the railroad itself. You see here in the early map, there was a huge railroad yard there right now, which is largely abandoned. If they put I-49 through downtown, it'll go right through what was the railroad yard at one time back then. But then once this attracted the railroad industry, then other industries came here, and that really began the economic development. And so after this time period, you see the population growth really take over, and that's why we're the big city and not Opelousas or St. Marksville or Franklin or whatever. But what's really interesting here, how was this railroad built? I found multiple newspaper clippings at the time saying this was prison labor. And if you're aware at the time, basically the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery or indentured servitude except as a punishment for a crime. So if you were convicted, you could then be sentenced to hard physical labor. And so given the all-white legal system, they could trump up any charges against you and then put you to hard labor. And this was done. This was called prison leasing or convict leasing. And it's been called slavery by another name because it was basically legalized slavery. And so what the state did was lease out inmates. They would make some money. And you see here it says over 100 convicts are grading. While another large force of convicts is grading the road near the Vermontown River. So this railroad was built essentially by pseudo-enslaved black labor by and large. There were almost no white convicts at this time in these forces. But beyond that then, as I'll talk about in a moment, if you were black, you could not get the good, you could not be a railroad engineer. We saw the education discrimination, you wouldn't have the qualifications, and just because of racial discrimination, they wouldn't hire you for any of the good paying jobs. So all of this industry that grew up, it went almost exclusively to whites. The only, maybe if you there's a term called a section worker in the railroad, where basically, you're laying track and repairing track. It's hard physical labor. You might be hired for that, but that would be about it. So anything that involves hard physical labor. So this benefit of the railroad benefited almost exclusively whites in town. And here you see the career differences at the time. And just like that racial and sexual classification, and even married classification prior to the Civil War, it still in large part existed here throughout at least the first half or more of the last century. Now, if you were a white man, you had pretty much any career opportunity open to you. If you were a black man, you were essentially limited to a few careers, anything that involved hard, or just physical labor, did not require an education. You could be a teacher in a black school, you could be a minister in a black church, maybe you could be a small business owner, but you could only serve black customers, and entertainers were allowed, so you could entertain white folk, that's fine. You could entertain black folk as well, but that's one of the few careers that were really open to you. If you were women, if you were married with young children, you were expected to stay at home with your kids. And this is why still you didn't have women lawyers, women doctors, and basically any married women with careers, because you were not allowed. The white business owners would say, the men would say, well, we're not going to hire you. You're a married woman. You should be at home with your children. Now, if you were single, you could still do a few jobs, but you were pretty limited. Some of the common ones would be nurses, teachers, maybe teachers, a few teachers in black schools, and again, you could be an entertainer. That was acceptable to whites at the time. So you see very, very different career options that were, with any feasibility, open, depending on whether you were white or black, man or woman, and whether you were married or not. And here just to see a few, there's a whole large collection of other similar photos that would have overwhelmed you. Clerk of Court Louis Perret has a collection of historic photos there, and there's all kinds of photos, like Labco and all kinds of other photos, where it's just all white men from this time period. Every photo of any kind of local organization, unions, businesses, it's all white men. So here you see bus drivers, the Medical Association of the parish, the city police department. There are two women here. You might not be able to see. There's a woman here and a woman here in skirts. They were meter maid. Go around and check to make sure people put the money in the parking meter. That's what you could do if you were a woman in the police force. And none of this ended until the 1964 Civil Rights Act then finally prohibited racial and sexual discrimination in employment. So what about the oil and gas boom? Well, there were, this is a big part of our local economy, has been, at least since the mid-1900s. You had discoveries of oil and gas in this region. And Lafayette, you might not be able to see very well, was more centrally located. And this is actually 2019 data. I wasn't able to find a historic map here. This is from the U.S. Energy Information Agency. But you see it's a little more centrally located, a little bit farther to go to New Orleans, farther to go to Baton Rouge, a little farther to go to Lake Charles. So we were the biggest city that was closest to the heart of the oil rigs in the Gulf. And this started the Lafayette Oil Center in 1952. But again, look at this data. The Lafayette Parish data to go back, high school data, college education data. The education was so disparate for white and blacks that if you were trying to apply for any of these good paying jobs in the oil and gas industry, by and large, only whites had the educational credentials to qualify for them. And even if you were black, there was such discrimination at the time. There was a lot of oral histories. It's in the citations here if you look on the slides later when you go online. LSU did a great collection of oral histories of older men at the time who had worked in the oil industry going back into the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And they said, both white and black, they said, we just wouldn't hire you if you're black. And we didn't do it until we were forced to do by lawsuits under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And one guy even said that until the 1964 Civil Rights Act, if you were black, you weren't even allowed to go into the Gulf of Mexico, even on a shrimp boat. He said he'd be afraid to be shot. And so these oral histories show that this was not open to black people. So all of this oil and gas boom almost exclusively went to white people. And in fact, if you think about it, then because of this disparity in hiring, even if in the 1960s you were hired, well now, 20 years later, you're now in your 40s, let's say around 1980, now you're at what should be the peak of your career. You've advanced, you're promoted, you've now got the experience to be really high-level managers or whatever in the oil industry. Well, again, because you were hired and blacks weren't, that meant that all the really good paying jobs were in the hands of whites in the oil industry, or almost exclusively. So it was sort of a compound effect that education, or the disparity of education led to a disparity in hiring, a huge disparity in hiring, and then that led to a huge disparity in the people that were making all the money off of the oil and gas industry. So it was, again, really compounded. These inequities just compounded over time. And there were all kinds of other differences between whites and blacks. I'm not going to go over it except to show, I have one prop here, if I can find it without too much trouble. Oh, don't tell me I forgot it. Well, I forgot it. I had a copy of the Green Book, the 1963 Green Book. I know. And it's a little tiny thing. It's really thin. And the point is that's the only safe places you can go in the entire United States. And you see here, well, it's probably blurred. There was one listing for Lafayette, and this is the 1963 Green Book. The Burgess, I guess it would be pronounced, tourist home at 416 Washington Street, which is just an empty lot now. And so that was the only safe place you could go in Lafayette if you were traveling from outside the state. Because a lot of cities, and it wasn't so much local cities, but if you were outside of a place in the country where there was a lot of black people and it was an exclusively white community, they were called sundown towns. You could not be in the town at all. Hotel or anything, you could not be in the town after sundown if you were black. You would be arrested or worse if you were black. But anyway, the point is it was very, very, very different for whites and blacks. Now we do have some success stories in Lafayette Parish. Paul Breaux, Lafayette educator, and these dates, this is not their lifespan, this is the years in which they served in that capacity. Jefferson Caffrey, Calise Saloom. Jefferson Caffrey, of course, large street named after Calise Saloom. Calise Saloom also got a name after him, a large street. Maurice Hyman, the Hyman Center, he actually donated a lot of the land and arranged to where Girard Park, Lafayette General Hospital, the Hyman Center is. But here's something I want to point out, and I don't want to take anything away from the success and the hard work of Caffrey and Saloom and Hyman, but the point is that Paul Breaux, who became a Lafayette educator, he did not have any of the opportunities open to him. Jefferson Caffrey graduated from UL. Paul Breaux was legally forbidden from doing that. Calise Saloom became a judge. Paul Breaux was forbidden from getting a law degree or being a judge in Lafayette Parish. Maurice Hyman became a large respected business owner, very wealthy, where other white business owners would work with him. Paul Breaux, even if he had been wealthy, first of all, he wouldn't have had the chance to become wealthy, and secondly, even if he was, very unlikely a lot of whites would have worked with him. So the point is that they succeeded, but Paul Breaux and other people like him did not have the same opportunities to succeed, and to have major streets named after them, for example, or major centers named after them. Now, because the white community received the bulk of government support, whether it was education, economic development, or whatever, it meant that the black community had to turn within itself for support, and these were called benevolent associations or societies and lodges. And this is just a very partial list. I've already found, just since I made this slide, a couple others. But the point is that if you couldn't turn to the white government for any support, you had to support yourself. So two totally different sources of support in the city and the parish. So what about the summary here? Two different worlds. Two cities, but really two different, almost literal physical worlds of white and black, and metaphysical worlds in Lafayette Parish. And you see here, I only put mostly unrestricted because of segregation. If you were white, it was expected you wouldn't go to the black restaurant or the black neighborhood or whatever. But you see here very, very different worlds. And I often get asked, well, who did this apply to? Well, Louisiana law actually defined you as black if you had any traceable amount of African ancestry. Now think about that, any traceable amount. So this was often referred to as the one-drop rule, that if you looked, that you even had the slightest bit of African ancestry in you, or if it was known that, your great-great-great-grandmother was black, that's it, you are now legally defined as black. And you are subject to all these restrictions. You can't marry anyone who's white, you can't live in a white neighborhood, you can't go to a white restaurant, you can't vote. Everything was applied to you. All these restrictions. And so because the suppression was so great, what you see is what historians refer to as the Great Migration. It wasn't just in Lafayette Parish, but all across the South. Black people said, well, you know, it's not, and believe me, there was still a lot of discrimination, a lot of prejudice, a lot of oppression outside the South. But it wasn't nearly as bad, and so millions of black people in the South said, we're gonna go north or west, especially to cities where there's more jobs, to try to find at least some better hope for educational and economic opportunities, and this was called the Great Migration. There you see the drop in that's the overall South. And here I charted just Lafayette Parish, and you see this is the same graph you saw on the first slide. The black population steadily declined, the white population steadily increased, because all these economic opportunities that I talked about, the railroad and the oil boom, those were only open by and large to white people, so that attracted whites to move to Lafayette Parish. And because all these opportunities, both educational and economic, and because of other oppression, it was denied to black people, a lot just left. And so that resulted in the demographics that we have today. So this history really affected the demographics of our community. And again, this was a systematic pattern throughout the region. I tracked the census data for all the different parishes, and you see it was better and worse, or better or worse in some parishes than others. Lafayette was one of the worst, except for St. Mary Parish, which was even worse as far as the relative change in the black population due to the Great Migration. So the conclusion here, what's the point of all this? It's not just truth for the sake of truth, although I'm a big fan of truth and knowledge. But you've heard this expression before, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. You know, we don't want this to happen again. And that's the same reason why we talk about the Acadian expulsion or the Holocaust and slavery. We talk about these things because we say we don't want these things to happen again. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Whatever it is, if something wrong happens, we want to make sure people learn about it so they see what happened and why it was wrong. And cultural amnesia is like individual amnesia. Just like if you woke up this morning and didn't know who you were, you would know what you're supposed to be doing, where you're going. And so it's really important that we have this sense of identity, a shared identity. I also say here, marginalizing people is both wrong and foolish. So it's wrong because it's hurtful, but it hurts yourself. And here's the example I'd like to use. So let's say you live in a house with your family, but they have, in all the family photos, they leave you out of it. All the family photos on the walls, the family photo albums leave you out. When they have birthday parties, they leave you out of it. They don't celebrate your birthday, right? They don't talk to anyone about you. And then one day, you know, there's a hurricane, the roof's leaking pretty bad, and they say, hey, you need to help us fix the roof. Are you gonna wanna help? No, because you don't feel like you're a part of that family. And so now that family has been foolish because now when they need your help, it's too late. And so for the same reason, if you make people feel welcome and included, then you're going to say, okay, let's work together to solve the problems we have. We have shared problems in Lafayette, you know, whether it's drainage and schools and roads and whatnot. Let's work together to work. But in order to work together, we have to make people feel welcome and included. So if you exclude others, you're not just hurting them, you're hurting yourself. That's the key point there. Another point here is that trust is earned. If I can't believe that you're honest about the past, how can I trust you going forward? Like in any relationship, a friendship, even a business partnership or a marriage, right? So I have to be honest about, okay, here's what happened. Now you can trust me. I'm being honest about it. So going forward, you can trust that I'm going to continue to be honest and work with you. And here's a real big point. This is still recent history that still affects us. I mean, remember, Lafayette Parish schools first started integration in 1971. There's still massive discrimination in the oil industry up until the Civil Rights Act started to get enforced through lawsuits. You can talk to a lot of people, I'm sure in this room even, and they can talk to you that they suffered a lot of discrimination well past the passage of the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act. And here you see we're still a largely segregated community when it comes to, now not legally segregated, but what lawyers call de facto. It's like, as a matter of fact, it's resulting. So we still have de facto segregation in our schools, in our neighborhoods, even our Mardi Gras crews, we still have white and black Mardi Gras crews. And here you see, you know, we have the white south side and the black north side. And think about this, where is the economic development occurring? Where are the schools located? Where are the hospitals located? Where are the libraries located? Where is the better quality, where's the money going into streets and boulevards and any of that stuff? Where are the resources being placed? And so these historic patterns still in large part exist today, and they exist today because of these historic inequities. And so you can't understand the solutions going forward unless you understand, here's, in large part at least, where these historic inequities came from. So you have to understand this past in order to understand and have an accurate picture of these problems. And here's a big point, all right? So none of us here, everyone is slave. I'm going to trust that no one in here is old enough to have ever, supported segregation, or that you would. So this historic discrimination is in the past. But now the question is, now that you know the situation, okay, when we have the lingering inequities left over from this discrimination, now the question is, okay, you are responsible for your choices today. What are you going to do going forward to say, okay, I can be a part of the solution. I can either pretend it doesn't exist, these inequities, or I can just say I don't care about the inequities, or I can say, okay, I realize they exist, I care, and I'm going to try to work with our city government, organizations, and my neighborhoods, and whoever, my churches, to say I'm going to try to do something about it. So again, you're not responsible for the past, but you are responsible for your choices today and going forward, what you do in response to inequities that exist in society. And so that's the question. What are you going to do going forward to, instead of having this two different histories or two different cities, what are you going to do going forward to try to make this one Lafayette going forward? Thank you.
Statue moved to an appropriate location.
I gotta say, you really touched me. I'm kind of speechless at standing over. So thank you.
We're gonna get Kim. Kim's gonna help, I think. Dr. Swanson is gonna field some questions. There'll be two of us, one on either side of the aisle. If you would wait for us to get the microphone to you, then Dr. Swanson will be happy to engage in some dialogue with you.
Yeah,
Anybody
before I take any questions, I want to point out again, if you missed a lot of the detail on the slides, here is the link where that entire presentation is in the PDF format. You go to there, and there's some other documents I have, related documents, but just look for Swanson Lafayette Parish History presentation in PDF format. And there's a hand.
One over here
okay.
and a couple over there.
Go ahead.
So let's start over here, and then Kim, you do the next one.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. Thank you for this wonderful presentation that many people believe they know, but really we don't know. Now we know. What you say at the end is what for me matters. Let me ask you just one question. When you notice that Lafayette party start to change, be more diverse, and people start more integrated in Lafayette parties, when is the point?
Yeah, I think it was basically the civil rights movement was successful, in large part. It passed civil rights legislation. Notice that the success of the civil rights movement and the end of legalized discrimination ended the Great Migration. And then you see the diversity of the parish beginning to increase too. I suspect that it'll be a little bit higher in the 2020 census as well. So I think in these past few decades now, we see it's starting to come together. For example, I've given talks to organizations that weren't integrated in the past, and they have become recently. Or even look at this audience. A few decades ago, this could not have occurred. Maybe legally it could have occurred, but it would have been socially taboo for this much of an audience to come together and have it filmed. People would be, I'm not going to be a part of that, because people, what are they going to say? So we really have improved a lot. I mean, we have a long way to go, but I really see a lot of improvement in the recent decades.
This young woman over here, okay.
Oh.
Hello, good evening, Rick, and thank you so much. You deserve that standing ovation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. My question is so important that I wrote it down to me, and so bear with me. I don't believe that the average American is a racist deep down, but I do believe that most Americans are vastly undereducated about the horrendous history of racism in the United States. we've developed what I call an advanced strategy of silence. And no doubt partly because this history is so unbelievably painful. I believe you're as sick as your secrets. You're as sick as your secrets. Because of that, your work, Rick, is critical. But your work is also very painful. Just sitting here tonight in the audience, I really got sick at my stomach. And so here's my question to you, Rick. In all your research, what has been the most surprisingly personal, painful thing you've uncovered?
Well, going back to, and thank you for the question, my wife, who's somewhere here, she can vouch that at times as I've been reading through accounts of slavery and the Reconstruction violence, the mass systematic violence during Reconstruction, I've turned to my wife and said, I'm depressed. I mean, just learning this history is depressing. I can't even imagine what it would have been like to go through that, the almost hopelessness that people must have felt at the time. And so, I always suspected, knowing the general, well, before I started doing this research in Lafayette Parish, I'd known the general history of the South and I'd known it was bad. But because of sort of the common but mistaken myths about Lafayette Parish, I thought, oh, it wasn't so bad here. Turns out it was just as bad, if not worse than a lot throughout the South, as you've seen. And so, one of the things that struck me was when I was reading through the Vermilionville Freedmen's Bureau reports, leading up to the 1868 election, and how there had just been a massacre up in Opelousas of black voters to try to stop them from voting. And there wasn't a massacre in Lafayette Parish, but there were assassinations of black political leaders. And that it got to the point, according to the reports of the Vermilionville Freedmen's Bureau officer, that the white people were going around just parading weapons openly in the streets, and black people had fled the towns and where they were living and were congregating way out in open fields, guarding throughout the night, keeping watch for fear they were about to be massacred. That happened in Lafayette Parish. And so it's just astounding that that occurred here and no one ever knew about it. And I didn't know about it until I read in this handwritten scrolls, it was long lost. It wasn't lost, it's just nobody knew about it. Reports of the Vermilionville Freedmen's Bureau. But I mean, it is painful.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Yep.
Wait, no. Back.
Hello. Thank you for your hard work and presentation and inspiring inclusion. I recently learned about a part of the history of post-Civil War history, which involved a phenomenon referred to as contraband camps, of which there were many in Louisiana. And there was a book written by an author named Jim Downs called Sick from Freedom. And it's about the fact that in these camps, many thousands of freed slaves died from starvation and disease. And I wondered, and I felt compelled to ask you about, did you come across any information of this part of our history, which I was totally disturbed about and unfamiliar with? Thank you.
Yeah, in fact, that's another example where it was just really depressing to read about. That after you had, I talked about it earlier, over 10,000 people were freed during the Civil War by Union forces and brought to the area of Morgan City and areas east of there. And in large part, the able-bodied men either joined the Union Army or they were put to work on plantations for pay now. And they were supervised by either the Union or other government agencies. But women were taking care of children, and certainly children couldn't work, and there were a lot of elderly and infirm people who couldn't work, and so they were in these large camps being provided for by Union forces or other government agencies. But unfortunately, the U.S. government is trying to fight a civil war, and this is thousands of miles from Washington, D.C., and they were overwhelmed. They were overwhelmed by the humanitarian relief effort because they did not foresee, they hadn't thought it through, frankly, about how much humanitarian relief would be needed. And so, a lot of it it's very tragic because the conditions were very horrible. Look, a lot of historians say that more soldiers died in the war from disease than did from being shot because disease were rampant in close quarters. And in these camps, diseases ran rampant at the time, the same diseases that ravaged the Union and Confederate forces. And just, thousands and thousands of people died from diseases in these camps because there just wasn't enough food, or certainly there wasn't enough medical care or even just space There wasn't enough attention given. And so it was a failure of foresight and just resources on the part of the U.S. government to provide for, to provide for the full amount of humanitarian relief that was really necessary. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
We have a question.
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. As usual, I know we all enjoyed the presentation. It's enlightening. I often think about the lack of access, the denial of access that roughly half of the population experienced when it came to having access to great jobs like offshore. And the lack of foresight, the lack of vision of the social engineers of the day who denied that access because of a person's skin color.
Yeah.
Did they not realize, and I'm asking you as though you have,
Yeah, you talk very good.
it's incredulous to me that
Right.
they denied, no, it's incredulous to me that they saw to it that half of the population would remain impoverished.
Yeah.
Not understanding the residual effect that that kind of engineering would have on an economy, because I think we're still suffering today.
Oh, we are.
And it's not just blacks.
Yeah.
It's the entire community, society in this area that's
Sure.
suffering because of those early decisions
Absolutely.
that those men made, thinking they were harming one group of people.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in some of my earlier talks in the past couple of years, I've talked about this. I mean, look at this population here. The white population said to the black population, we're going to deny you an education and any opportunity to accumulate wealth and any opportunity to do business with the other half of the population. So we're going to purposely, intensely suppress half of our economy in the state. And Mississippi did this as well, and some of the other southern states. Now, some have overcome this, and some haven't. This is why Louisiana and Mississippi are always competing to be, who's at the lowest ranking for various measures. Because, and so, why do we have such bad roads in Louisiana? Because of segregation, because of the economic oppression. Yeah, because you can't hold back half your state's economy for 100 years and then expect to have a booming economy and booming tax revenues that allow you to do economic development. So we are still collectively paying a heavy price as a state for this intense short-sightedness. You're absolutely right.
And that's just in economics. I mean,
Right.
moral.
Yeah, right. I'm just saying, even as a practical matter, it was, even for the white people to say, we're going to do this, was intensely short-sighted because they were only hurting themselves and their descendants.
Okay, we have another question over here.
Yeah.
I think we all know that we're stuck in a lot of these patterns that were created from the beginning. And I guess my question is, do you know of any communities that we could look to that have really turned it around? I lived in Chicago for a long time and they had problems there. There's no city that I can think of that really has it the right way, but maybe a southern city that has really done a good job. I mean, our elected officials still look like that picture, of all the white men. I mean, even the presidency, except for one. And I just wonder, just somewhere we can gain inspiration and how to move forward, because I feel stuck.
That's a good question, and that's not something I have studied nearly to the degree. This has been pretty intensive. I mean, every waking moment, sometimes for the past 2 years I've been doing this. So I haven't done a lot of comparison work, but when I get the chance to travel, I kind of travel around. And my wife and I can tell you there's some examples that we've seen that were really interesting. Like the city of Natchez actually has done some racial reconciliation, unlike Vicksburg. Vicksburg is still their old city courthouse, for example, in Vicksburg, tells a complete lost cause version of the Civil War, saying happy slaves getting married and all kinds of stuff. But Natchez actually did some truth and reconciliation. If you look at actually Birmingham, Alabama, for example, they've taken what was a brutal civil rights history, but turned it into basically to say, we're going to, by openly telling the truth, now there's all kinds of museums that attract people and monuments. The New Equal Justice Initiative, a big, amazing monument, very moving. And so they turned what was a negative in the past into a positive to say, look, people are craving true history, true and accurate history. And so when you create that, it brings in tourists that say, okay, we want to learn about this history. It brings in people from the state, from the surrounding areas outside Birmingham, and even from outside the state. Even if you look, for example, at the recently built National African American Museum, History Museum in Washington, D.C., It's so popular they had to go to a lottery system even to get tickets. Right? Because people have a hunger because they know this truth is out there and it hasn't been told, and so they want it. So if you start telling the truth and you embrace that, that can be a positive message going forward to say, look, businesses come here, people come here. We're honest about the past. We're in the process of reconciling. We're moving forward together as a community, and that's a strong selling point. If you're, for example, in a chamber of commerce, you can say, when you're trying to attract businesses, we're not racially, if this is the case, right? You can say we're not racially divided anymore, not nearly as much as we were. We're coming together. We're trying to embrace each other and be honest about the past. We're trying to do this truth and reconciliation. And so that's what businesses are looking for. That's what their employees, young people are looking for, cities they can move to where they can feel like this is a city that is embracing racial diversity. And so you can turn it into a positive. Well, my wife. I have to. Yeah. I better answer this one.
And Montgomery.
What's that?
Montgomery.
Oh, that's right. It was Montgomery, not Birmingham. I'm sorry. Montgomery is the example. Yeah. Thank you. Always go with whatever the wife says. That's right.
Any other questions or comments? Anybody else? We have one right over here. Hold on.
Could you tell the story of the statue and what are the obstacles to and prospects for getting it moved?
Well, what?
I can answer that.
Oh, Fred wants to take that one.
Okay. Here, Fred.
I presume everyone knows the obstacle that prevents the statue from being moved now is a court injunction that was put in place in 1980. The old Sears building that's now City Hall was converted from the Sears building to the City Hall, and the mayor wanted to transfer the statue there. And the Daughters of the Confederacy, who had donated the statue in 1922 to the city, filed suit. They did not want the statue moved. So, and the suit involved the injunction that transpired. So it's the injunction that's preventing the statue from being moved. The city attorney gave an explanation to citizens where a meeting was held in 2016. And he explained the injunction and gave one option available where the parish council could indeed move the statue. And the option was if circumstances changed.
That's a legal term, actually. Change in circumstances. No, it is.
Now somebody gets to define what is the change. Is it the attitudes of people who live here, who decide, that statue has outlived its time? That would be a serious consideration to take into account. I don't think that's going to happen. There will be, I can tell you this much, there will be a legal challenge to the injunction in a very, very, very short time. The challenge will come from the mindset.
Oh, yeah, of course.
I was just going to ask him if you could put up a counter monument down there instead of removing the statue. You can't. You put a counter.
Consideration was given to that, and I'll tell you why it was ruled out. Someone thought about putting a Martin Luther King statue right next to it, but that would be an insult to Martin Luther King.
We've got a couple more minutes. Anybody? Yes, go ahead. And then.
Hi, everybody. I'm from California, and I've been so surprised at the separation here that you don't see in a lot of the other Western states relative to racism. My question is, what do you feel, Rick, and perhaps even you, Mr. Prejean, What do you feel, and your, young lady, your question was very pointed. I think we all feel the same way, that we want to do something, and yet we all feel stuck. But I think this is an idea that whose time has come. My question is, what can we do as a collective people to promote togetherness, the real togetherness of us as one from an economic, social, racial perspective? I know it's a big question, but we've got to start somewhere, and this is certainly a profound start.
Yeah, that's a great question. A friend of mine, Skylar Rito, says make sure whenever any decisions are being made, make sure there are people who are affected at the table, being part of making those decisions, right? So if you're in an organization, whether it's a church or community organization or a government agency, and you look around you and you say, the people in this room don't look like our city. What can we do? What can we do to get people that look like our city in here? What are we doing? Are we telling people they're not welcome? Are we doing something unintentionally to make people feel like they're not included in that welcome? And so go out of your way to try to be more inclusive. And then all of you, right, join organizations and say, let's try to ask as an organization, what can we do? Whether it's, again, neighborhood organizations, churches, government agencies. Each little person can only do a little piece of the puzzle, right? But working together, we can then create a different new big picture. So just each person has to ask themselves, what can you do? But I would say, work with organizations. Find any organization that's nearby you and join them and work with them and say, hey, what can we do to try to improve our city and create more together? Question, Barry? Oh.
There you go.
Back to the statue issue. Some of you may be aware that Darrell Bork and other people caused a statue of Amity Hardware, the great Creole musician, to be erected, and it ended up in the St. Landry Parish Tourist Visitor Center, just outside of Opelousas. Although Amity Hardware was more associated with the Eunice Basile area, couldn't get anybody to return a call there. The point I'm getting to is that, that statue, the Bouton statue, is inappropriately in a prominent place, which is why they don't want to move it. But in addition to that, in addition to moving it to, I don't know what an appropriate place to be, but a museum maybe. But I think that, in my experience of traveling around, especially Europe and even Canada, we don't have a good track record of telling our story, of our history. We don't have enough statues. We don't have a lot more statues. I mean, we should have a statue of Martin Luther King, but we should also have a statue of Paul Bro, and any number of other community leaders who have done amazing things here. Carlton James, among others, and that's the only way to cause a conversation that we've been avoiding very carefully for too long to happen. Because even people in the white population, if they go by a statue of, say, Carlton James, who the hell is that guy? Well, let me tell you. So, on the one hand, I think we need to do something appropriate, whatever that is, with that statue. But I think that we ought to get better at telling more of our story. You don't get much of anywhere by subtracting. You get somewhere by adding, and I think what we need to do is add this huge missing piece.
That's what I'm trying to do?
Yes.
Yeah.
Add this huge missing piece to our story, and so that we can all learn it together.
Yeah.
I'd like to respond to your adding. Very good point. First of all, there's a statistic that I want to tell folks. Professor talked about General Banks coming through Lafayette, going to northward bound and freeing some 10,000 slaves. Louisiana produced more black volunteers in the Civil War than any other state.
Wow.
Louisiana.
Yeah.
And I often wondered why, the 10,000 I'm sure plays a big role in the number of blacks who served in the Union Army. That 10,000 answers my question. Now, what can you do? One of the things that I would recommend, I grew up in North Lafayette. I live in North Lafayette to this day, not the same place, but to help develop North Lafayette, you would be helping all of those black people you saw on the map. Now, the administrators, and I don't want to point out anybody in particular, but those folks who have been running Lafayette have, in my opinion, intentionally neglected the north side, don't want to create wealth there, because once there is wealth, then there is politics that get involved, and then politics get involved and control becomes a matter. And white folk don't want that black competition, to make a long story short. So just think about how many people would be benefited from the urban development of North Lafayette. Yes. That's something you can push for. Now, in terms of having more statues, the lieutenant governor of this state was in town yesterday, this morning. And I did not get to go to his meeting, but he's going around and he's talking about tourism. And on the 29th of last month, his staff held a meeting here at the Clifton Chenier Center to recruit people who could provide information that would assist in the creation of a civil rights trail throughout the state of Louisiana. I got selected to organize a committee of people in this area to serve in trying to put together identifying people, places, events, and stories, all related in the broadest sense to civil rights. That committee will meet right here in this room on the 22nd of this month at 6 o'clock. The room is already reserved. I'm asking for volunteers. If you would like to be a part of the committee who comes up with these ideas. Now, of course, you got to realize the state is interested in that because they want to draw tourists here. Come spend your money here so the legislators can spend those tax dollars. That's their interest. My interest, and the people I've talked to, is that this civil rights, people, places, circumstances, stories, it's going to involve things that happen to black folks. So by coming up with these items, we will be telling the story, the history of civil rights in Lafayette City and Parish. And we've been encouraged to go beyond the city and the parish, but we got to see how that works out. But certainly Lafayette City and Parish will be involved in the collection of that data, will be provided to the state and be publicized. The state will publicize those places and stories and with other ideas we come up with. Lafayette, our group here in Lafayette is setting the pace for the entire state. We were the ones who convinced the staff of the lieutenant governor to create a committee to allow local people to come up with these ideas. And they bought it. And they took it to Lake Charles, then they took it to Alexandria, and now they're going all over the state creating committees that we convinced them to do. So if you are interested, on the 22nd of this month, please come to this room. And we're going to have some resource people. We've got a number of resource people from the university who have volunteered, people who have experience in doing historical research. But historical research is not the only thing that needs to be done. There are individuals, if you know, some of you may know elderly people who have stories that would be very interesting and should be told. There are all kinds of things. Just as the folks here in Lafayette came up with the idea to create committees, we're going to come up with additional ideas of what the state ought to be showing to people who come here. So your ideas are needed. Please come.
We have one more.
Yeah, one more, because I don't want to impose, you've all been very
Mr.
gracious, so one more
Mr.
question.
Jones.
Yeah.
Yes, my name is Wilkin Jones. Wilkin Jones, I'm from St. Landry Parish, Opelousas, Louisiana, St. Landry Parish. And the question is, what can we do as a group to circulate the information that we receive from Dr. Swanson? I have an idea, I just started Rural African American Historical Museum in Opelousas, Louisiana. One thing we can do, give some donations. I have a GoFundMe account for Rural African American Museum. We can use some funds. We can use some frames. I use typing paper, copy paper. Volunteers. So that's one thing, one drop that we can do in St. Landry Parish. I know everybody else in here got their own little baby, they want to try to promote it, but I say that's one thing you can do for our nonprofit organization, 501c3.
How would they contact you? If they need to contact you to help you out, how would they do that?
I have some cards over here.
Okay, see him after this.
I don't know if I have enough for everybody. Okay, I'll come pass the run.
And there's a lot of information. Again, if you want, some of the information in there was about St. Landry Parish and Opelousas. Take a look at that link and you'll find some of the information in that.
And also, my first time author, I wrote about the Honeycutt case. Maybe some of you people heard about it in St. Landry Parish. Honeycutt, he was prosecuted for raping a white lady in Eunice, Louisiana, and they took him out of the jailhouse and brought him to the Chapelai River with the intention of killing him, and he got away. And at that time, they had the chair at Angola every year. They'd take the chair and go around the state in 1948, 1949, 1950. From Angola to Baton Rouge to Alexander to Shreveport, and in each one of the parish, every year they had one person that either rape or murder somebody, and they'd execute them. And there are 64 parishes, so every year they would execute at least one person in each parish. So that means at least 64 blacks were executed compared to one white. So I have the book Honeycutt. It's at Barnes and Nobles, or it's on the internet at Amazon. So if you want to buy it, you're welcome to buy it. And one more thing, I'll turn the mic over. I'm writing a book now about the riot of 1868 in Opelousas. So keep your eyes open. Keep your wallet open and
keep our hearts open.
Here we give Dr. Swanson a hand. Thank you.
Segregation was made illegal because that's the